Kelsey Smith Briggs was a sweet, joyful little girl until she was caught in a deadly tug-of-war between the very people who should have protected her. At just 3 years old, she found herself trapped in a vicious game of lies, manipulation, and betrayal. Her mother, Ray Dawn Smith, fought tirelessly to keep Kelsey safe, but the forces working against them were more powerful than anyone could have imagined. In just a few short years, Kelsey's life turned into a nightmare, one no one saw coming, and when tragedy struck, the justice system failed her, leaving the real culprits free to carry on with their lives. What went wrong? Who was truly responsible for Kelsey's death, and why was the truth buried beneath a mountain of lies? This is the shocking, heart-wrenching story of Kelsey Smith Briggs, one that will leave you questioning everything about loyalty, justice, and the high price of family secrets. But before we begin, I just want to take a moment to thank you, my incredible viewers and subscribers. Your likes, shares, and thoughtful comments don't just support this channel, they help keep these stories alive. If you're new here, welcome. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and become part of this growing community that believes every story deserves to be told and no victim should ever be forgotten. Now, let's get into it. Kelsey Shelton Smith Briggs was born on December 28, 2002, at 10 p.m. in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, to her mother, Ray Dawn Smith. Kelsey, weighing 7 pounds and measuring 19 inches, entered the world as a beautiful, perfect little girl. But behind her arrival, there was already uncertainty. You see, her mother, Ray, had just gone through a painful divorce from Lance Briggs, Kelsey's father. At the time, no one was quite sure if Lance was really Kelsey's biological dad. Ray had doubts, and even Lance wasn't certain, leaving a cloud of confusion hanging over Kelsey's early months. By the time Kelsey was 3 months old, a paternity test confirmed what Ray had always feared. Lance was indeed the father. But here's the twist. Lance, who had played a significant role in creating this new life, had no intention of playing a role in Kelsey's. While Ray was left to pick up the pieces, Lance barely made a ripple in his daughter's life. Oh, there was one thing Lance did. He called Ray, not to express joy or excitement, but to declare, "She will have my last name." So Ray complied, and just like that, Kelsey became Kelsey Shelton Smith Briggs. Imagine this little girl, her tiny hands gripping her favorite Cabbage Patch doll, the one she held so tightly as she drifted off to sleep each night. She loved to watch the movies Brother Bear, Shrek, and Monsters, Inc., her eyes lighting up every time she saw her favorite characters on screen. She wasn't just a kid, she was a bundle of life and energy, happy, outgoing, always smiling. She loved swinging, her laughter echoing through the air as she soared higher and higher. But it wasn't just the movies or the swing that brought her joy. Kelsey was the kind of kid who could light up any room with her smile. She was the kind of child who would grab your heart and hold on to it with that same innocent strength, never letting go. You could see the love and innocence radiating from her every time she played. It's hard to believe that a child so full of life and love could be caught in the crossfire of a broken family, where manipulation and control overshadowed the basic need for protection. Ray Dawn Smith and Lance Briggs' story wasn't one of simple love, but rather one of twisted, complicated emotions that had been building since their high school days. They had been high school sweethearts, the kind of couple everyone knew would either end in marriage or disaster. Their love was intense, but so was the darkness that followed. After graduation, their relationship took a rocky turn. It wasn't the usual growing apart that happens to many couples over time. No, this was something much more damaging. They rekindled their bond after some time apart, but there was always an undercurrent of tension between them, one that would only get worse. It wasn't long before the ugly side of Lance's character began to show. By the time Ray was pregnant with Kelsey, Lance's temper was a ticking time bomb. Police had been called to their home multiple times due to violent incidents that had escalated beyond just heated arguments. But the worst came one night when Lance, consumed by rage, punched Ray in the stomach. That blow didn't just shatter the quiet of their home, it shattered Ray's body and her dreams. The impact of that punch caused her to lose their first baby, a miscarriage that would leave scars deeper than any physical wound. But Lance didn't stop there. No, his violence only escalated as time went on. His addiction to alcohol and drugs went out of control, fueling his outbursts and rage. He wasn't just a husband, he was a predator, constantly hunting for control, for power, for any way to make Ray feel small. Ray tried to escape, tried to break free, but each time she thought she had done it, Lance would pull her back into the mess of chaos he had created. He would show up at her work, at her home, sending threatening messages and breaking into the house they once shared, leaving disturbing notes, leaving destruction in his wake. It was clear that Lance couldn't handle rejection, couldn't handle the idea of losing Ray, even if he had been the one pushing her away with his hands, his anger, and his addiction. So, in May 2002, Ray made a decision that so many victims of domestic violence struggle with. She filed for divorce. It was a step toward freedom, but Lance wasn't going to let her go that easily. Instead of letting go, he chose to stalk her, to break into her house, to keep pushing his way back into her life with threats, with destruction, with a promise of chaos. It was as if he was saying, "You think you can leave me? I'll make sure you never forget me." Lance wasn't interested in letting her live her life in peace. He was driven by control, by the belief that no matter what he did, he deserved to be at the center of Ray's world. But what makes this all the more sickening is the presence of Lance's mother, Kathy Briggs. She was no innocent bystander in this tragedy. Kathy Briggs was a force in Lance's life that enabled his violent behavior, that turned a blind eye to his maltreatment and made excuses for him when no one else would. Instead of supporting Ray and seeing Lance for the dangerous man he was, Kathy defended him. She put all her energy into denying his faults, pretending that everything was fine, that Ray was the problem, not her son. Kathy was a woman who couldn't bear to face the truth, that her son was a monster in the making. Since Kathy is a major character in Kelsey's life, we should explore her background and see how it ties into the whole story. Kathy Briggs, Lance's mother, was a woman whose own past was steeped in turmoil, and her actions, or lack thereof, would cast a long shadow over the tragic fate of her granddaughter Kelsey. Kathy's life had never been easy, and her decisions throughout the years reflected a disturbing pattern of manipulation, control, and a dangerous blind spot for the truth. As a young woman, Kathy had her first child, Shreya, at the age of 17. Soon after, she had a second daughter, Gina, but the children's biological fathers were never consistent in their lives. This chaotic foundation was only made worse when Kathy married Kevin Robinson, a man who seemed to be just as unstable as she was. In 1979, after a series of volatile incidents, Kevin was found dead from a gunshot wound, and Kathy claimed it was due to depression over not being able to see his children. But the mystery surrounding his death, with no clear explanation, left lingering questions that would never be answered. But it wasn't just her tragic past that was disturbing. It was how Kathy's actions in the present constantly seemed to enable and perpetuate the cycle of violence. Years after Kevin's death, Kathy had threatened to kill her own children in a fit of rage, a chilling declaration that prompted the system to intervene and temporarily take custody of her kids. However, rather than confronting her own demons, Kathy remarried and regained custody of her children, including Lance. Despite her history of instability and the violent patterns within her own family, Kathy's influence over Lance remained strong. Kathy's refusal to acknowledge Lance's maltreatment created a dangerous environment not just for Ray, but also for Kelsey. She was willing to cover up the truth and paint Ray as an unfit mother in order to keep her son's reputation intact. So by 2003, Lance Briggs had remarried. His new wife, Ashley, became an important figure in Kelsey's life, but not in the way most would hope. Ashley bonded quickly with Kelsey, and it seemed like a new chapter for the family. But while Ashley tried to embrace the role of stepmother, Kathy Briggs, Lance's mother, was still playing her own dangerous game behind the scenes. Kathy couldn't let go of her need to control the situation, and now, with Ashley in the picture, Kathy had a new strategy. Kathy's obsession with getting custody of Kelsey escalated. She began to instruct Ashley to do things that no new mother-in-law should ask of her daughter-in-law. Kathy told Ashley to follow Raye, to stalk her wherever she went, whether it was to class, to work, or even to her own home. It didn't matter. Kathy wanted to know where Raye was at all times. This wasn't just about being a concerned grandmother. This was about keeping tabs on Raye, controlling the narrative, and making sure that she had eyes everywhere. Kathy's harassment didn't stop there. She made sure that any time Ray did anything she deemed suspicious, she'd make a call. And that's exactly what she did when she reported Ray for driving erratically. In 2003, Kathy called the police, telling them that Ray was speeding and driving recklessly, endangering Kelsey's life. Kathy didn't care that it wasn't true. She was so focused on painting Raye as an unfit mother that she'd do whatever it took to ruin her reputation. But the police officer who was on the same road that day told a completely different story. There were no signs of erratic driving. Kathy's claims were false, and the police quickly saw through her deceit. It wasn't just the police who saw through Kathy's manipulation. A few months later, during a conversation with Raye, the police officer suggested that Kathy might actually have a case for custody. They told her that if she really wanted to pursue custody of Kelsey, she could. It was a chilling statement, one that marked the beginning of Kathy's relentless pursuit of control over her granddaughter's life. Kathy now knew that the legal system could be used as a tool to take Kelsey away from Raye. But Raye wasn't backing down. She had moved in with her parents after her split from Lance and was trying to rebuild her life. She had started receiving state welfare assistance and was juggling multiple jobs to make ends meet. Despite her struggles, Raye was doing her best to care for Kelsey. She even enrolled in college at Seminole State, trying to better her future and provide stability for her daughter. But the reality was that Kelsey's life was already being shaped by the tensions between her parents and grandparents, and the battle for her future was far from over. However, in August 2004, Lance was drafted into the Army and sent overseas to Iraq. Kathy used this as another opportunity to maneuver for custody. Despite Lance's violent history, despite his complete lack of interest in parenting, Kathy saw Lance's military service as her golden ticket to gain legal rights over Kelsey. Kathy immediately went to court, trying to get legal assurances that she and her family could still see Kelsey while Lance was away. She pushed for more time with Kelsey, manipulating the situation to further her own agenda. But then, something happened that shifted the balance. In late 2004, Ray's father, Kelsey's grandfather, passed away after a long battle with cancer. Raye, grieving and trying to make sense of it all, moved her and Kelsey into their own apartment in Meeker, Oklahoma. It was a fresh start for both of them, or so she hoped, but Kathy wasn't going to let go that easily. She still wasn't ready to relinquish control, and she fought harder than ever. Around the same time, in October 2004, Raye met a man named Michael Lee Porter at a local bar called Hot Rods in Harleys. Michael was a father himself with 2 children of his own and was the president of his family's magnet plant in Meeker, Oklahoma. He had a solid reputation in the community, at least on the surface, but it didn't take long for things to take a darker turn, once Raye and Michael became a couple. Soon after they started dating, Kelsey began to suffer from mysterious injuries. In January 2005, Raye rushed Kelsey to the hospital after the little girl cried out in pain, unable to use her arm. When doctors examined her, they found bruises on Kelsey's body, as well as a broken collarbone. Initially, Raye explained that Kelsey had fallen out of her toddler bed in the middle of the night. The doctor, after hearing Raye's account, dismissed any concerns about maltreatment and allowed Kelsey to leave with her mother. But things wouldn't stay simple for long. Just days later, Kelsey was at her father Lance's house, visiting him while he was home on leave from the military. Lance, along with Kelsey's stepmother Ashley, were about to give Kelsey a bath when they noticed more bruising on her body. This time, they suspected mistreatment. They immediately took Kelsey back to the same emergency room she'd visited just days before. Police were called to investigate, and Lance, along with his mother Kathy, told doctors that they suspected Ray had intentionally harmed Kelsey. The severity of Kelsey's injuries became undeniable. Authorities took 9 different photos of the bruises on her body, and a nurse confirmed that the bruising appeared to be consistent with maltreatment. To add fuel to the fire, Lance told an officer that if Ray had been drinking, she would sometimes go overboard. He also made sure to mention Michael, Ray's new boyfriend, suggesting that he might be involved in Kelsey's injuries. When Ray was interviewed by a detective, she stuck to her story that the facial bruising had come from Kelsey's fall out of bed, but she couldn't explain where the other bruises had come from. The officer speaking with her believed Ray was telling the truth and seemed genuinely concerned for Kelsey's well-being. Despite this, the authority took note of the injuries and began documenting them as potential signs of maltreatment. On January 24, 2005, a hearing was held, and a judge decided that Kelsey should be temporarily removed from Ray's care, sending her back to Kathy's house. A child welfare worker had investigated the situation and believed that Kelsey had been hurt while in Ray's care. Ray admitted during a conversation with a child services worker that she had spanked Kelsey's bottom while she was wearing a diaper, but she insisted that was the extent of her physical discipline. Michael Porter, though, stood by Ray. He wrote a letter defending her, describing her as a loving and responsible mother who would never hurt Kelsey. Despite his support, the legal battle over Kelsey's custody raged on. By the beginning of February 2005, Ray was granted supervised visits with Kelsey, and she was eventually allowed unsupervised overnight visits, but with a condition. Michael was not allowed to be present during these visits. Ray also had to agree to attend parenting classes as part of the ongoing investigation. As Kelsey bounced between her mother's and grandmother's homes, things continued to spiral. New injuries began to surface. In April and May of 2005, Kelsey was once again brought in for medical attention after bruises appeared on her body. Ray explained that Kelsey had fallen, but Kelsey's stepmother Ashley grew increasingly concerned. She claimed that the injuries were becoming more frequent and seemed to happen every time Kelsey returned to her mother's care. Ashley began to make accusations that Kelsey's injuries only started after Michael entered the picture. But despite the mounting evidence of maltreatment, Ray was caught in a system that couldn't seem to break free of the influence of Kathy and Lance's constant manipulation. On April 18, 2005, just days after marrying Michael at the Shawnee courthouse, Kelsey limped on her right leg. The injury had occurred on April 14th when Kelsey, wearing platform flip-flops, had fallen and twisted her ankle while at the zoo with her aunt. Ray immediately took Kelsey to the ER, where doctors diagnosed a sprained ankle. They advised Ray that Kelsey could still walk, but she needed to rest the ankle. And there. After the wedding, Kelsey went back to Kathy's house, and despite walking just fine hours before, Kathy claimed that Kelsey suddenly refused to walk when she arrived at her house. Kathy didn't take Kelsey to the doctor for 4 days, leaving her in this condition. Instead, she took Kelsey to gymnastics during her stay, even though Kelsey wasn't walking. The questions began to pile up. Why would Kathy take Kelsey to gymnastics if the child wasn't even walking? And why didn't Kathy inform Ray about the issue? When Kelsey returned to her mother's care, Ray grew increasingly concerned about Kelsey's legs and took her back to the ER. It was then that doctors discovered spiral fractures in both of Kelsey's legs, injuries that raised alarms about ongoing maltreatment. The right leg injury, according to doctors, had occurred at the zoo, while the left leg injury seemed to be the result of Kelsey putting too much weight on it as she tried to compensate for the pain. The doctors didn't believe the injuries were intentional, but they did place Kelsey in casts for the fractures. But the chaos continued. Kathy, unsatisfied with the doctor's conclusion, sought a second opinion. She took Kelsey to another doctor who decided that the fractures were indeed a result of child maltreatment and removed the casts. But once Kelsey was back in Ray's care, the casts were put back on. The protective system, who had already begun suspecting that Kathy or someone in her home might be responsible for Kelsey's injuries, had no concrete evidence to act on. Then, on April 27, 2005, Kelsey suffered yet another injury, a knot the size of a quarter near her eye. Kathy claimed that Kelsey had been accidentally elbowed by her new stepsister while she was sleeping, but given the numerous injuries Kelsey had already sustained, the authorities became involved once again, and Kelsey was removed from her mother's care on May 3rd. She was placed with her maternal grandmother Gayla Smith, while Rhea and Gayla were allowed supervised visits with Kelsey at a DHS office. It was clear that something was terribly wrong, but both Rhea and Kathy denied the allegations of maltreatment. Gayla, who had spent nearly 2 years living with Rhea and Kelsey, knew just how much Rhea adored her daughter. She refused to believe that her daughter could have harmed Kelsey. However, during supervised visits with Kathy, Kelsey began to act out. She would hide from Kathy, throw things at her, and even try to bite her. At daycare, Kelsey's behavior had also changed. She began biting and pinching other children. Her hair was falling out, and she refused to eat or take naps. Everything about Kelsey had changed, and the pressure on Rhea and the manipulation from Kathy kept mounting. As Kelsey's behavior deteriorated, DHS continued to try and contact Lance, but Kathy kept avoiding their attempts, telling them that Lance was always moving around with the military. However, during supervised visits, Kathy would receive phone calls from Lance, yet she refused to share his contact information with Child Services. It became clear that Kathy's manipulation was causing problems at every turn. The DHS had received so many false reports from Kathy that they eventually began to ignore them. A hearing took place in June 2005, where it was decided that Kelsey would return to Rhea's care, but the decision was met with resistance. Kathy continued to spread rumors, and Rhea's fight for custody was far from over. Kelsey's return to Rhea's care was not without its complications, and the battle for her future was only intensifying as the months went by. On October 11, 2005, not long after a child services officer had conducted a routine visit to the house, a devastating event unfolded. Kelsey was left in the care of her stepfather, Michael Porter, while her mother, Rhea, went out to pick up Michael's daughter from school. When Rhea returned to the home, she found an unimaginable scene. Kelsey, who had been sleeping peacefully in her bed, was now being loaded into an ambulance. She wasn't breathing, and strangely, she was now wearing a pull-up, something Michael claimed was because he was concerned about what others might think if Kelsey wasn't wearing one. By the time the paramedics arrived, it was clear that Kelsey had been down for quite some time. The doctor later estimated that Kelsey had likely been unresponsive for about 45 minutes before the paramedics arrived, meaning her injury had occurred sometime around 3:15 p.m., when her mother was away. Despite the frantic efforts to save her, Kelsey was pronounced dead on the way to the hospital. The cause of death was later determined to be blunt force trauma, a kick to the stomach. But the horrors didn't stop there. It was also discovered that Kelsey had been SA. These revelations sent shockwaves through everyone involved, though the tragedy was far from over. What followed was a heart-wrenching investigation, beginning with Michael's own daughter. She eventually spoke to her guidance counselor, revealing disturbing details of what she had witnessed in the home. She told the counselor that her father had instructed her never to talk about what happened when they were alone with Kelsey. She recalled how Michael would be kind to Kelsey when others were around, but when they were alone, his behavior was cruel and mean. Kelsey, according to the daughter, would cry and vomit whenever Michael gave her a bath. She also revealed that she had witnessed Michael going into a bedroom with Kelsey, closing the door, and later seeing Kelsey come out crying. Authorities were soon alerted, and Michael's personal computer was searched. The results were chilling. Investigators discovered illegal content involving child exploitations on his device. Michael was arrested on October 20th, just 9 days after Kelsey's death, and charged with first-degree murder. Before Ray could even grasp the gravity of the situation surrounding her daughter's death, she had already called for an autopsy. But Michael, acting strangely, questioned the need for an autopsy and even pretended to suffer 2 heart attacks to divert attention from the situation. Meanwhile, authorities attempted to contact Lance, Kelsey's biological father, with the terrible news, but they couldn't reach him. It turned out Lance and his mother, Kathy, had been dishonest about his military status. Lance wasn't just fresh from Iraq as they had claimed. He had actually tested positive for drugs and had spent time in a military rehab facility in Fort Benning, Georgia. His dishonorable discharge was imminent due to drug charges and allegations of assaulting a superior officer in Germany. Despite being far removed from the situation, Lance would later be dragged into the scandal that followed Kelsey's death. Ray, who wasn't even home when Kelsey was fatally injured, found herself arrested and charged in connection with the death. The public backlash was fueled, in part, by Kathy Briggs, who had launched a campaign to have Ray arrested. Kathy had even been emailing Michael, asking for his help in accusing Ray. By January 2006, Kathy had set up a meeting with Michael to convince the district attorney to use his testimony to prosecute Ray. She argued that Ray had been the one who had maltreated Kelsey long before the system had become involved. But the irony didn't go unnoticed. Kathy herself had claimed to have never seen any signs of bruises on Kelsey until 2005, even though Ray had been accused of mistreatment for much longer. Michael was offered a plea deal. Despite being the one who had killed Kelsey, he pled guilty to enabling child maltreatment in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but the real kicker? His testimony against Ray. In it, he claimed that Ray had maltreated Kelsey multiple times and that he had witnessed it. His testimony directly contradicted his earlier statements to Child Services, where he had raved about how great a mother Ray was. His defense also pointed out the inherent contradictions in the case. Michael, who had been so quick to defend Ray in the past, was now accusing her of heinous acts. But the prosecution didn't care. They had their star witness, and that's all they needed. At Ray's trial, her lawyer argued that she had made a grave mistake in marrying Michael Porter. They also contended that Ray had been wrongly accused of Kelsey's earlier injuries, largely due to the ongoing family conflict between Ray's side and Lance's side. Despite this, the jury convicted Ray of enabling child maltreatment, and she was sentenced to 27 years in prison. Ray's legal team has since argued that she had no way of knowing what was happening to Kelsey, and they've requested a new trial or resentencing. They pointed to a legal loophole in the Failure to Protect statute, which states that a parent may be charged if they knew or should have known about the maltreatment. They argue that this law has been used excessively to throw mothers in prison, even when they had no direct knowledge of the maltreatment. The disparity between Ray's sentence and Michael's is striking. He was given 30 years for enabling the maltreatment, but she was sentenced to a much longer term for Failure to Protect her daughter, despite not being the perpetrator. Meanwhile, Michael's whereabouts remain unclear. He was placed in protective custody, and there's no way to know where he is today. As for Ray, she remains incarcerated. In November 2019, cameras were allowed into the Mal Bassett Correctional Center, where Ray gave a powerful interview on criminal justice reform. She continues to fight for a commutation of her sentence, determined to clear her name. After Kelsey's death, Lance and Kathy Briggs filed a $15 million lawsuit involving Child Protective Services, challenging the agency's handling of her case. Under the lawsuit's terms, half of any settlement would have gone to Ray, unless she were convicted of involvement in Kelsey's death. Following her conviction, the entire settlement was awarded to Lance and Kathy. And in 2009, The lawsuit was settled for $525,000, with an additional $100,000 provided by a private agency representing Oklahoma Youth Services. Kathy also established a nonprofit in Kelsey's name, attempting to raise funds for the case. But this too was marred by controversy, as the Attorney General stepped in and ordered Kathy to cease the use of the funds after it was discovered that they had been misused. Kelsey's death brought about Kelsey's Law, which went into effect on November 1, 2006. The law increased the power of the Department of Human Services, as well as other state agencies and judges, to intervene in cases of child maltreatment, ensuring that children in dangerous homes would be given the protection they desperately needed. Kelsey Smith Briggs was laid to rest on October 15, 2005, at Parks Brothers Funeral Home and was buried at New Hope Cemetery in Meeker, Oklahoma. Kelsey's story was one of tragedy and heartbreak, but it also became a catalyst for change. It sparked debates about justice, the inadequacies of the child protection system, and the blurred lines of guilt and responsibility. Her death raised questions about how the system failed her, how manipulation and false accusations contributed to her suffering, and how much blame should rest on those who failed to act. The fight for justice in Kelsey's name continues to this day, leaving a legacy that will not be forgotten. And that brings us to the heartbreaking conclusion of Kelsey's story, a tale of manipulation, systemic failures, and an innocent life lost too soon. What do you think? Should Kelsey's mother have been held responsible for what happened, or was the system at fault for not intervening sooner? How much blame should fall on Kathy and Lance for what they did? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story left you unsettled, don't worry. There are plenty more gripping real-life cases on the channel that explore similar themes. Make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video. It's crucial we keep these stories alive. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.